1989, Colombian mountains. A family hiding from authorities in a cold cabin. The daughter is shivering from the cold. There's no firewood, and then the father reaches into a bag and starts throwing stacks of bills into the fireplace. One stack, a second, a tenth. That night, $2 million burned, used as ordinary firewood. This isn't fiction. This is a real story from the memoirs of Pablo Escobar's son. And you know what's strangest? For Escobar, this was a rational decision because he had too much money. So much that it transformed from an asset into a problem, into a burden, into something that needed to be burned to warm a child. Today, we'll break down the most insane business model in human history. A model where profits were so enormous that money literally rotted in the ground. Where rats devoured millions of dollars and the owner didn't care. Where one person spent $2.5 billion a year just on bribes, and this was considered normal overhead. Get ready. Because the numbers you're about to hear will change your understanding of how money works. Let's start from the very beginning, with the basic mathematics of production. In the Colombian jungles of the early 80s, a farmer could grow the necessary raw materials practically for free. Seeds, land, water, sun. Minimal investment. After a few months, he harvested the leaves. A kilogram of leaves cost about $10. Just $10. These leaves went to underground laboratories in the jungle. There they were processed into paste, then into pure product. All the chemical processing cost approximately $1,000 per kilogram of finished product. Add packaging, transportation within Colombia, chemists' salaries. In the end, the cost of 1 kilogram came to about $1,500. Remember this figure. Now watch what happened to this kilogram next. Escobar transported the product to Miami or other U.S. cities. Transportation costs, planes, boats, bribing border guards, added another couple $1,000s per kilogram. Total, 1 kilogram in Miami cost the cartel approximately $4,000, all expenses included. And how much did this kilogram sell for? $60,000 wholesale. A markup of 15 times. 15 times. No legal business in the world generates such margins. Even luxury brands, even pharmaceuticals don't come close to these numbers. And if you consider that dealers then diluted the product and sold it to end consumers, the final street price reached $200,000 per kilogram. But wait, the story gets even more interesting because Escobar didn't sell by the kilogram. He sold by the ton. His organization produced and transported to the U.S. up to 15 tons every month. 15 tons. That's 15,000 kilograms. Multiply by $60,000 in pure profit from each kilogram. That's $900 million in pure profit every month. Almost $1 billion every month. Now, multiply by 12 months. That's almost $11 billion a year. And this is only Escobar's profit. The Medellin cartel controlled about 80% of what entered the U.S., but other groups worked there too. Escobar's total income by the most conservative estimates was $21 billion a year. In today's money, that's more than $60 billion annually. Imagine this, $60 billion every year. That's more than the GDP of some countries. That's more than the annual budget of half of Africa's nations. One person controlling a financial flow comparable to a national economy. And all this from a product whose cost is $1,500 per kilogram. But here's the thing. This enormous money created a problem that no ordinary businessman thinks about. The problem of the physical volume of cash. Because the product was sold for cash. No bank transfers, no checks, pure cash. And when you receive $1 billion in cash every month, mostly in small bills, you face a logistical nightmare. Let's look at the math. $1 million in $100 bills weighs about 10 kilograms. $1 billion, that's 10,000 kilograms. 10 tons of paper money. Every month, Escobar received literally tons of cash, and most of it wasn't in hundreds, but in 20s and 10s. This increased the weight and volume several times. Imagine, rooms stuffed with bags of money, warehouses filled with stacks of bills, money everywhere. And here begins the craziest part of Escobar's story, because he had so much money that it became not an asset, but a burden. There's documented evidence that Escobar spent $2,500 a month just on rubber bands to tie stacks of money. $2,500 on rubber bands. Does this seem trivial? Against the backdrop of billions, yes, but this shows the scale of the problem. The amount of money was so enormous that even supplies for storing it cost thousands. But that's not the craziest part. Escobar had so much cash that he physically couldn't store it in safe places. Banks were out too many questions. Storing everything in one place too risky. So he scattered money across dozens of hiding places, buried it in the ground, hid it in walls of houses, stored it in secret warehouses. And here the losses began. There's testimony from Escobar's brother, Roberto, who managed the cartel's finances. He said they lost about 10% of cash every year simply due to spoilage. 10%. From $20 billion, that's $2 billion annually. $2 billion simply written off as inevitable losses. Why? Because money rotted from moisture. Rats ate it. Yes, rats literally gnawed on bills. Some hiding places were forgotten or their coordinates were lost. Part was confiscated by police during random discoveries. Think about this, $2 billion a year written off as operating losses. That's more than the profit of most Fortune 500 corporations. For Escobar, this was an expense item called natural shrinkage. He didn't even try to fix it, because profit was still so enormous that losing 10% didn't matter. It's like for an ordinary person losing 10 cents from a dollar. Unpleasant, but not critical. And now that famous story about Escobar's insane economics, a story that perfectly illustrates the absurdity of the situation. Once Escobar was hiding from authorities in the mountains with his family. It was cold. Very cold. They didn't have firewood, and you know what Escobar did? He burned $2 million in cash to keep his daughter warm. $2 million used as firewood, because there was more money than firewood. This story is confirmed by his son Juan Pablo, who later changed his name to Sebastian Marroquin. He described this episode in his memoirs. His father burned approximately $2 million in one night so the family wouldn't freeze. For Escobar, this was a rational decision. Money was the least valuable resource at that moment. He had too much of it, and it was useless in the mountains. And warmth for his family was necessary. Perverted logic, but mathematically justified. Now let's talk about Escobar's second huge expense item, about corruption. Because his business model wasn't built just on production and sales. It was built on buying an entire state. Escobar didn't hide from authorities, he bought authorities, and this cost him astronomical sums. By various estimates, bribes to officials, police, judges, politicians, and military personnel consume $2 to $3 billion annually. $3 billion on corruption. Every year. To understand the scale, let's break down how this worked. At the bottom level, ordinary police officers. Escobar paid an ordinary policeman in Medellin about $500 a month to turn a blind eye to his operations. With an average police salary of $200, this was more than double. Several thousand police officers on the payroll, that's already millions a month. Higher up were officers, precinct chiefs, regional commanders. Their price was higher tens of thousands a month each. Judges received even more hundreds of thousands for the right verdict or for delaying a case. Governors, senators, ministers, their price was measured in millions. Escobar offered the Colombian government to pay off the entire national debt of the country $10 billion in exchange for a guarantee of immunity. The government refused, but the very fact of such an offer shows the scale of his financial capabilities. But corruption for Escobar wasn't just an expense, it was an investment in business protection. Every bought policeman that's information about raids. Every bought judge that's a case falling apart in court. Every bought politician that's lobbying for needed laws. Escobar was building parallel power. He was creating a state within a state. And while his income measured in billions, spending $2 to $3 billion on corruption was a reasonable investment. Let's calculate the overall picture. Income $21 billion a year, minus $2 billion for natural money losses, minus $3 billion for corruption, minus about $1 billion for operating expenses, salaries for thousands of employees, transport, weapons, security, laboratories. That leaves approximately $15 billion in pure profit annually. $15 billion with nowhere to put it. And here, Escobar faced a problem that no other criminal in history had solved. What to do with this much money? He couldn't put it in a bank. Any large deposit would attract attention. He couldn't invest in business too actively. Where would someone in his position get legal capital? He couldn't spend on personal consumption. It's physically impossible to spend billions on yourself. So Escobar started doing what seems like madness from the standpoint of normal economics. He buried money in the ground, literally. Throughout Colombia, there were hiding places with cash, plastic barrels and containers filled with dollars, buried in jungles, on farms, in mountains. Billions of dollars just lying in the ground, not working, not bringing profit, just stored, slowly rotting from humidity and becoming food for rodents. By some estimates, after Escobar's death in 1993, hiding places remained in the ground totaling about $3 billion. $3 billion that were never found by his family or authorities. Just lost money. Coordinates forgotten, people who knew the location dead or silent. Somewhere in the Colombian jungles, Escobar's billions are still rotting. But not all money was buried. Part Escobar tried to legitimize through business. He bought real estate houses, ranches, land. He built an entire neighborhood in Medellin for the poor, gave away hundreds of houses for free. He built soccer fields, schools, hospitals. He became a folk hero for poor Colombians. This wasn't pure charity, it was buying popular support, and it worked. When police hunted him, thousands of people in Medellin slums protected him because he was their benefactor. Escobar also invested in legal business, restaurants, stores, taxis, construction companies. Essentially the same scheme Al Capone used, laundering money through legal business. But the scale was different. Capone controlled hundreds of businesses. Escobar owned thousands. Entire city districts worked for him. Officially, he was the owner of a modest taxi business. Unofficially, he controlled a significant part of Medellin's economy. Another expense item worth mentioning: violence. Escobar wasn't just a businessman, he was a terrorist. When corruption didn't work, he used fear. Judge won't take a bribe, eliminate his family. Politician speaks out for extradition, blow up his car. Policeman too honest? Remove him. Journalist writes exposés? Silence him. Escobar personally ordered thousands of killings, the most famous, the Avianca plane explosion in 1989. 110 people perished. The target was one presidential candidate. The candidate wasn't even on board, but Escobar still ordered the plane destroyed. This was a message: I can reach anyone, anywhere. The operation cost a few $1,000s for explosives and executors. The effect: a country paralyzed by fear. In total, on Escobar's and his cartel's account, more than 4,000 killings. This doesn't count victims of wars with competing cartels and victims among consumers. Violence was part of the business model. Expenses on hired killers, explosives, weapons, another few $100 million a year. But again, against the backdrop of income of $20 billion, these were acceptable costs. The price of doing business. Now, let's talk about the most interesting aspect of Escobar's economics, why his business model was practically invulnerable from a financial standpoint. Even when authorities confiscated tons of product, even when laboratories were destroyed, even when key people were arrested, the cartel continued working and bringing in billions. Why? The answer is in the mathematics of marginality. When your markup is 1,500%, you can afford to lose half the shipments and still remain profitable. Let's calculate. A kilogram costs $4,000, sells for $60,000, profit $56,000 per kilogram. Now let's imagine half the shipments are confiscated. That means from 2 kilograms on which $8,000 were spent, only one sells for $60,000. Profit $52,000, still enormous margin. This is precisely why fighting this trade is so difficult. Even massive confiscations don't critically affect cartel economics. Escobar planned for losses. He sent more to the U.S. than needed, knowing some would be intercepted. This was a cost built into the model, like taxes for legal business. Only instead of the tax office, it was losses from DEA and Coast Guard. Moreover, each large confiscation even worked for Escobar in a certain sense. When authorities seized several tons, supply in the market fell, prices rose. Those shipments that got through sold for more. The market self-regulated in favor of producers. This is the economics of scarcity. The harder it is to deliver goods, the higher the price. And while demand remained huge and legalization wasn't even discussed, prices stayed at astronomical levels. There's another aspect of Escobar's economics rarely discussed: the impact on Colombia's legal economy. Billions of dollars from his trade didn't remain in a vacuum. They poured into the Colombian economy. Construction, real estate, restaurants, stores, all this created jobs. Thousands of people indirectly depended on cartel money, even without participating in the trade directly. By some estimates, during the peak years of cartel activity, up to 10% of Colombia's GDP was somehow connected to this money. This created a paradoxical situation. On one hand, the cartels were destroying the country with violence and corruption. On the other, they were a significant economic factor. When Escobar was eliminated in 1993, Medellin's economy temporarily slumped. Thousands of people lost their source of income. This shows another side of prohibited goods economics. When a black market reaches such scales, it becomes part of the economic ecosystem. You can't just turn it off without consequences. It's like a tumor that has grown into healthy tissue. Removing it is difficult without damaging the entire organism. This is precisely why the fight against cartels proved so long and complex. Let's now talk about Escobar's fall and what this says about his business model. After many years of dominance, pressure from U.S. and Colombian governments gradually increased. Special units were created. Competitors entered the picture, especially the Cali cartel. Internal betrayals began. Escobar eliminated too many people, and even his allies began turning away from him. Eventually, in December 1993, a special police group tracked Escobar down in Medellin and shot him on a rooftop. He was 44 years old. During his life, he earned by various estimates from $30 to $50 billion. But what remained for his family? Practically nothing. Most assets were confiscated, frozen, or simply lost. His widow and children fled the country and lived modestly. This shows the fundamental weakness of Escobar's model. You can earn billions illegally, but you can't preserve them and pass them to the next generation. There's no legal protection, no guarantees. Anyone can take the money by force. The state confiscates everything it finds. Competitors eliminate you for market share. Accomplices betray you for rewards. Illegal money flows like water through fingers, comes quickly, leaves even faster. After Escobar's death, the Medellin cartel collapsed, but the trade didn't disappear. It was taken over by other organizations. The Cali cartel continued until it too was crushed. Then came Mexican cartels, then other groups. The business model remained, because the fundamental economics didn't change. Huge demand in the U.S. and Europe, ban on production and sale, consequently astronomical prices and super profits for those willing to risk. What can we extract from Escobar's economics? First lesson: bans on goods with high demand create black markets with incredible profitability. When the state prohibits what millions of people want, it doesn't destroy demand. It simply hands the market to criminals and gives them the opportunity to set any prices. This is an economic law. If there's demand and no legal supply, illegal supply will fill the void. Second lesson: scale matters. Escobar became so powerful not because he was smarter than other traffickers, but because he was first to understand the advantage of scale. He didn't work with kilograms, but immediately moved to tons. He didn't control one route, but created many. He didn't bribe individual people, but bought entire institutions. Scale gave him a snowball effect. The more money, the more opportunities for business protection. The better the protection, the more profit. And so in a spiral. Third lesson: money itself isn't the goal. When you have so much money you can't spend it, or even safely store it, it loses meaning. Escobar reached the point where money became a problem, not a solution. This is a philosophical moment. We all chase money. But what happens when there's too much? It becomes a burden. You need to hide it, guard it, justify it. Escobar's quality of life in his final years was terrible. He was hiding, running, afraid. With all his billions, he couldn't live peacefully. Fourth lesson: violence and corruption have limits of effectiveness. Escobar bought everyone he could buy, eliminated those who wouldn't be bought, but ultimately this worked against him. Too much violence united everyone against him, government, competitors, even part of the population. He became target number one, and no amount of money could protect him from everyone at once. Corruption works when it's targeted. When you try to corrupt the entire system, the system malfunctions and starts resisting. Fifth lesson: illegal business doesn't create long-term prosperity. Escobar earned tens of billions, but what did he leave? A destroyed country. Thousands of bodies, a family living in exile under false names, billions buried in the ground and lost forever. No legacy, no dynasty, no monuments except monuments to his victims. Legal billionaires create companies that live for generations. Illegal billionaires create a void that collapses after their death. Sixth lesson. The highest margin often means the highest risk. Yes, Escobar earned 15,000% profit, but the price of this profit constant threat of death, prison, betrayal. In legal business with a margin of 20 to 30%, you sleep peacefully. In illegal business with margins in the thousands of percent, you don't sleep at all. Risk and return are always connected. You can't get astronomical profit without astronomical risk. Seventh lesson. The economics of supply and demand works everywhere, even on black markets, even in illegal goods. High prices aren't traffic or greed. It's a direct consequence of prohibition. Remove the ban, and prices will drop 100 times. This is exactly what we see in places that legalized cannabis. Prices collapsed because legal production is much more efficient than illegal. Black markets thrive only where the state creates artificial scarcity through bans. Eighth lesson: corruption destroys states from within. Colombia in the 80s and 90s was practically a failed state. The judicial system didn't work. Police were bought. Politicians were afraid to make decisions. All this because of billions in illegal money that corrupted every institution. When a criminal organization earns more than the entire state budget, it can buy the state, and Escobar almost did it. Only international pressure and U.S. help stopped complete collapse. Ninth lesson: legalization may be more effective than prohibition. This is a controversial topic, but let's look at the numbers. The war on drugs has cost the U.S. trillions of dollars over the last 50 years. Result? Products are more accessible and cheaper than ever. Cartels have only become stronger. Maybe the problem is in the approach? Maybe prohibition creates more problems than it solves? This is a question each society must answer for itself. But Escobar's economics shows prohibitions on high-demand goods enrich criminals. And the 10th, final lesson: money without legitimacy has no long-term value. Escobar could buy anything except respect, except safety, except a peaceful life, except a future for his children. He was one of the richest people on the planet and one of the most miserable. He spent his last years on the run, in fear, in paranoia, slept in different places every night, couldn't trust anyone, watched as his friends and family were eliminated. This is the price of illegal billions. Now let's talk about what happened to the business after Escobar, because this shows another important economic principle. When you remove one player from the market, others take his place. The Medellin cartel collapsed, but the trade didn't decrease. It simply reorganized. The Cali cartel strengthened. Then came Mexican cartels. They turned out to be even more ruthless and efficient than Escobar. Mexican cartels learned from Escobar's mistakes. They were less public, bragged less, used terrorist methods less often that attract international attention. They diversified business, not just one product, but multiple types. They built more sustainable structures where removing one leader doesn't destroy the entire organization. Essentially, they applied corporate governance principles to illegal business. Today, more than 30 years after Escobar's death, the industry brings in even more money than in his time. According to UN estimates, global trade is valued at approximately $90 billion annually. That's 4 times more than Escobar earned in his best years. The market has grown, production has increased, prices in the U.S. have even fallen due to excess supply. The war has been lost from any perspective. This leads us to an uncomfortable conclusion. Escobar wasn't the cause of the problem. He was a symptom. The real cause: huge demand in developed countries and prohibition policies. As long as these two factors exist, new Escobars will appear, maybe with different names, in different countries with different methods. But the economics will remain the same. High demand plus prohibition equals astronomical profits for those willing to risk. It's also interesting to look at the social side of Escobar's economics. He wasn't just a criminal in the eyes of many Colombians. For the poor of Medellin, he was Robin Hood. He built houses for the homeless, gave money for food to the starving, built sports fields for children, paid for medical operations. In a country where the state didn't fulfill social functions, Escobar filled this void. This created a paradoxical situation. On one hand, he was a mass murderer and destroyer of the state. On the other, a philanthropist and folk hero. Thousands of people cried at his funeral. There are still Colombians who remember him warmly. This shows how economic inequality and state failure create ground for criminal authorities. When the legal system doesn't work, people turn to the illegal one. Escobar understood the power of populism. He invested millions in his image, not only through charity but also through media. He financed newspapers that wrote positively about him. He sponsored sports teams. He was even elected to Colombia's Congress for a short time, though later stripped of his mandate. He tried to legitimize himself through politics. It didn't work, but the very attempt shows his understanding that money alone isn't enough. You need legitimacy. Another aspect worth considering: Escobar's psychology. What drives a person who earns billions but continues risking his life? He didn't need money. He had more than he could spend in 10 lifetimes, but he couldn't stop. This isn't about money anymore. It's about power, about control, about proving he's stronger than the system, about ego. There's a psychological theory that very wealthy people stop being motivated by money. For them, money becomes a way to keep score in a game of power, influence, status. Escobar played this game to the maximum. He challenged not just police, he challenged the state, the U.S., the entire world. And losing in this game meant death. But he couldn't stop, because stopping meant admitting defeat. This is an important psychological lesson for everyone striving for wealth. Money is a tool, but if it becomes an end in itself or a way to feed ego, it turns into addiction. Escobar wasn't addicted to what he sold. He was addicted to the power that money gave. And like any addiction, it destroyed him. Let's also talk about Escobar's influence on pop culture. He became an icon: series, films, books, documentaries, his face on t-shirts, tours of his activity sites in Medellin, an entire industry built on his image. Why? Because his story captivates. Poor guy from the slums becomes one of the richest people in the world, challenges a superpower, lives by his own rules, dies in battle. It's an archetypal plot. But this romanticization is dangerous. It hides the real cost: thousands killed, destroyed lives of addicts, a corrupted state, fear in which an entire country lived, children who became orphans, judges and journalists killed for their work. This isn't a romantic story. It's a tragedy. But mass culture often chooses spectacle over truth. This is a lesson about how society chooses its heroes. We admire those who challenge the system, even if that system is law and order, even if the challenge leads to destruction. There's something primal in admiring a strong person who takes what he wants by force. But civilization is built on suppressing these instincts, on accepting rules, on collective good instead of individual power. Now, let's sum up all this insane economics. Pablo Escobar built a business model based on 3 pillars. First, astronomical marginality created by prohibition on a high-demand good. Second, scale of operations allowing market dominance. Third, systemic corruption and violence to protect business. This combination brought him $21 billion a year. But this same model contained seeds of self-destruction. Too much violence attracted international attention. Too much corruption destroyed state institutions, which ultimately led to harsh response. Too much money became impossible to protect and legitimize. And too big an ego didn't allow Escobar to stop in time and leave. His story is a warning about the limits of illegal economics. Yes, you can earn billions, but you can't keep them. You can't legally pass them to children. You can't live peacefully with them, and you can't build anything lasting on them. Escobar died at 44. If he had invested even a tenth of his energy in legal business, he could have lived to old age wealthy and respected. But he chose a different path and paid the full price. For society, his story is a lesson about the consequences of prohibition policies. Escobar didn't create demand. Demand existed. Prohibition didn't destroy this demand. It simply made satisfying demand incredibly profitable for criminals. If the goal was to reduce consumption, the policy failed. Consumption only grew. If the goal was to prevent criminals from enriching themselves, the policy failed even more. Escobar and others like him became richer than legal businessmen. Alternative? A complex question. Legalization and regulation can reduce criminal profits, but create other problems. More accessible substances can increase dependency. This is an ethical dilemma without simple answers, but Escobar's economics clearly shows the current model doesn't work. 50 years of war, trillions of dollars spent, millions imprisoned. Result? Products are more accessible and cheaper than ever. Maybe it's time to admit the prohibitionist approach has failed? Maybe it's worth trying other methods? Treatment instead of prison for addicts. Regulation instead of prohibition for less dangerous substances. Focus on harm reduction rather than punishment. Portugal tried decriminalization of all substances in 2001. Result? Reduction in overdoses, HIV infections, and related crime. It's not a perfect solution, but shows there are alternatives. Returning to Escobar. What remains of his empire? Ruins. Abandoned mansions, billions buried in the ground and lost, a museum in his former estate where tourists take photos, a son who publicly apologized for his father's actions and lives under a different name, a daughter who wrote a book about the trauma of living in the shadow of a father who was a terrorist, a country that needed decades to recover from his legacy. And what could have remained if he'd chosen a legal path, with his energy, intelligence, organizational abilities? Perhaps the largest corporation in Latin America, universities and hospitals with his name, charitable foundations actually helping people, respect and honor, a family that could be proud of him. But this didn't happen, because he chose the quick money of illegal business and paid with everything. In conclusion, Pablo Escobar's economics is a lesson about the danger of prohibitions, the power of market economics even in criminal spheres, and the limits of what money can buy. His story shows that money without legitimacy is emptiness, that scale without sustainability leads to collapse, that violence as a business strategy ultimately turns against you, and that the highest profit often means the highest price. If you're interested in the topic of illegal market economics, study further. Read books on the economics of this trade, watch documentaries that analyze rather than romanticize, study alternative approaches to substance policy, understand the economic mechanisms that create black markets. Knowledge is protection from manipulation and a way to make more informed decisions as a citizen. Escobar's story isn't a success story. It's a story about how the biggest money in the world couldn't buy the most important things: peace, security, and a future. It's a story about how economic laws work even where they shouldn't. And it's a cautionary tale for everyone who thinks the ends justify the means. Because in the end, the means determine not only the goal, but also the price that must be paid. And the price Escobar paid turned out to be too high even for a man who had all the money in the world.